I take a page from the amazing audio commentary for this movie, but I want to kind of start this with a little bit of a nostalgia trip. Yongary would often play on television when I was growing up. In particular, I believe the channel was called Encore. I was fascinated by this movie. I thought it was such a fun time. I was mesmerized by the monster in particular, and it took me years, actually, to realize that this actually wasn't a Japanese kaiju film whatsoever. It was actually a South Korean specifically, monster movie. But as I grew older and was watching it, the more I started seeing a lot of the flaws, in particular when the film was released finally on DVD and Blu-ray in its original aspect ratio. It's really dumb. It's not a good movie. It's quite an uneven kaiju movie in general, and it has some really laughable special effects in it. Why am I making this video dedicated to this film that I, supposedly don't really like? Well, to be honest, the audio commentary by Stever Ryfle and Kim Song-ho is what has changed my view on this movie a great deal, and I have to thank them for this. And because of their audio commentary, I suddenly now realize that this is more than just a Godzilla knockoff. And here's why. Hello, everybody. I'm your host, Adam Noyce. Welcome to AN Productions, where we discuss military history, film history, and history in general. Today, of course, we are talking about film history. And, well, let's get into this. So why should South Korea make a monster movie? Exportability. The success of Japanese kaiju movies overseas in Europe, South America, and especially North America could not be ignored even in 1967. So this leads to where and when and how this movie was made, and which is a truly fascinating story. This film was deliberately made and sanctioned by the South Korean government to broaden South Korea's international interests, in particular with arts and cultures. In this case, it was a movie. Now, Korea in general, not just South Korea, but Korea in general, was a different place in 1967 than it is today. In the time when this film was in production, South Korea was run by a dictator, Park Chung-hee, but he was also unbelievably anti-Japanese. Anti-Japanese sentiments were rampant in South Korea at this time, as they were desperately trying to find a new identity in of themselves. One such thing that the South Koreans were doing were often destroying a lot of these Japanese buildings because they resembled Japanese architecture. South Korea wanted to make their own architecture at this time. That was just one of the examples. So Yongary was made from the beginning to be an exportable film that deliberately would take South Korean cinemas overseas. In some ways, in a way similar to how Godzilla was made to help make Japanese cinema more exportable. And believe it or not, Yongary, it kind of worked. Though, at least here in the States, it wasn't released in cinemas, it certainly was played on television frequently. AIP Television released it. I guess it did have some theatrical releases over in Europe and South America. And actually, I think that this is arguably the first widespread South Korean movie to make it internationally at all. And that's something to be said for this little movie that could. But if this was the goal of the film, was to sort of spread South Korean culture, why a giant monster movie? Let's circle back to this idea. Well, there are a few answers and a few reasons for this. And first, I want to talk about the director. Ki-duk was known as the genre man. He wasn't exactly an auteur. He wasn't like an Akira Kurosawa per se. He made lots of crowd-pleasing movies rather than making art house films, for example. And all of them, just about all of them, were giant hits in South Korea. He made musicals, he made comedies, he made war films, he made lots and lots of dramas. I would also like to note here, just to show you how different the economy was in South Korea back then, a movie selling over 100,000 tickets back in the 1960s in South Korea was considered a big hit. So let that sink in compared to what South Korea's economy is today. One film of his that I've actually seen outside of Yongary Monster from the Deep is a film called Five Marines. It's actually a genuinely great film. It is on YouTube for free with English subtitles, and I do highly recommend that you check it out. And what's interesting is that this movie is actually more about the lives of these 5 Marines than the war itself. So there's actually hardly any fighting in the movie at all, but nevertheless, the movie was a huge smash hit. And Ki-duk was the man to find a niche needing to be tapped within South Korea. and making a movie within said niche. So he would make movies like Five Marines, or he really tapped into the teenage delinquency stuff. It's interesting that South Korea went through something very similar to Japan, Italy, even the United States, just kind of like a decade later. Over here, you had movies like Rebel Without a Cause, or the Japanese Sun Tribe films were very big in the late 50s, early 60s, and Kim Ki-duk made a film actually called The Barefooted Young. It is an interesting movie. It's full of lots of angst, and it's very similar to Romeo and Juliet, so it's nothing overly flashy. It's nothing new. For me, it's nothing new for anyone really watching the film, but for some reason, that movie was a giant hit. Now, here's another thing that we need to talk about. We need to talk about Park Chung-hee, because his regime frowned upon these teenage delinquency movies come the mid-1960s. He thought they were too scandalous. He was an extremely, extremely conservative man. So what he really wanted to push Korean cinemas to start making were more family-friendly, family-orientated movies than movies about biting social commentary. So what we saw within the mid to late 60s was a shift from these, angsty teenage dramas to movies, animated films. A lot of children's movies in general. Why not make a giant monster movie, right? They're popular, not just with adults, but also particularly with children. They would fit right in. So it's actually Kim Ki-duk's idea, after watching some kaiju movies, to make one of his own. And quite frankly, it kinda fit in with what the government deemed possible to make at this time. Now, 1967 was a big year for kaiju movies. All 5 of Japan's studios made a giant monster movie this year. Toho had 2. They had Son of Godzilla and King Kong Escapes. Daiei, you had Gamera vs. Gauss. Shochiku, you had the absolutely amazing piece of cinema known as the X from Outer Space. Nakatsu had Gappa, the Triphibian monster. And Toei, you had Giant Robo playing on TV, and they would soon start backing Yongary, Monster from the Deep. Now, before we continue, I would like to just point a couple of things out. I would like to say, hey, if you like this, we have tons of more videos on this channel about movie history and giant monster movie history and giant monster stuff in general. So hit the like button, hit the subscribe button. You'll be doing us all a favor. In terms of editing, it's just me putting this stuff together. You'd be doing me a great big favor. And by doing that, we'll be helping the channel grow, and I can make more of this type of content. And if you'd like, you can become an ANP volunteer. For only $1.99 per month, you have access to exclusive shows and exclusive behind-the-scenes content, and some more stuff is coming your way. And I haven't forgotten about you, the few of you who are currently signed up. Back to what you came here to see. So, going back to Park Chung-hee, what's interesting is that while all of this was happening, he was leading a huge crusade against anything Japanese. But he also wanted to export Korean culture internationally, other than, the fact that there was a war fought there about a decade earlier. And so when Kim Ki-duk presented this idea of making a giant monster movie with his producer Cha Tae-jin, well, a light bulb kind of lit. Duck and Cha Tae-jin were basically a creative duo in this time. Cha Tae-jin would produce a lot of Kim Ki-duk's films. Cha Tae-jin is widely credited for actually bringing anamorphic widescreen over to Korea in the early 1960s, for example, so he was also a pretty big dude. And together, what they wanted to do here was they wanted to make a hit and saw how exportable Japanese giant monsters movies had been. Let's make our own. You think, having even offered that idea, Cha Tae-jin and Kim Ki-duk would have been shot down almost immediately by the South Korean government, but instead, it was championed. Why, you might ask? Well, that was because if those special effects techniques could be taught to South Korean filmmakers, suddenly South Korean cinemas could make more of these special effects heavy movies and create basically a genre in of themselves separated from Japanese sci-fi, Japanese kaijus, Japanese tokusatsu. So essentially, the South Korean government decided to kind of turn a blind eye to the fact that this was going on over here in the making of Yongary, Monster from the Deep. They tolerated the Japanese suit makers and the few Japanese crew that came over here to South Korea to actually make the movie. And at the time, Japanese studios, most notably Toei, they were eager to broker, such a new international relationship. And a lot of this comes from, at around this same time, South Korea and Japan were working out a reconciliation deal, a reparations deal that had gone through, and Japan had finally admitted that they had done some absolutely terrible things to the Koreans and started giving them war reparations. Because we need to remember that South Korea and Japan, well, quite frankly, don't get along. They still don't get along today. Japan basically annexed Korea has annexed all of Korea basically since 1910. Literally only within the last 20 years had Korea actually been its own sovereign country again. And then it was cut in two. And for that period of time, starting in 1910, Japan ruled Korea with an iron fist and killed thousands upon thousands upon thousands of Koreans. Now, come the mid-1960s, those horrible wounds, they were in the process of being healed, though they will always be heavy scars there. Now, the result of all of this was indeed Yongary Monster from the Deep, a movie that could be very exportable. It was indeed family-friendly, and quite frankly, a bit fantastical. Cha Tae-jin and Kim Ki-duk pulled no punches when putting this movie together. This would be the most expensive South Korean movie produced thus far. To this point, 1967. Having all of that context in mind, in my humble opinion, it actually shows. The budget for Yongary Monster from the Deep was basically $200,000 US, the equivalent of that, and that is minuscule even in the 1960s or even in Japan. That was a big deal. In South Korea, that was a big deal. So Kim Ki-duk and Cha Tae-jin, they pulled no punches when they were making this movie. This is going to be a big film. The writer, So Young-sun, I'm so sorry if I'm mispronouncing that. I can barely pronounce Japanese names. I'm terribly sorry. The composer, Jeon Jung-kyun, he was one of the most prolific South Korean film composers of this era. According to some trivia, over 15,000 light bulbs were used for the miniature sets, and that was 2/3 of the available lighting equipment from studios across the country at the time. And what do we get? We do have lots of sets. We do have lots of explosions. We do have a monster that is seen a great deal throughout the film. It is a valiant effort. Well, as for Yongary, the monster itself, well, I've always kind of found the monster cool, if not goofy. It's not scary or imposing. I have to agree with Stever Ryfle. It no less struck a chord with me as a kid. I will always remember this monster. I would often draw Godzilla fighting Yongary when I was in, first, second, third grade. And from profile, I actually quite enjoyed this design, genuinely. I also like the darkened scales, how they're almost black instead of that charcoal gray that we see with Godzilla. And I also like the triangular-shaped spikes. From the front, well, it does kind of look scrawny, and it does have some uneven elements to the film. Most notably, the arms, I think, are laughably uneven. But honestly, my biggest problem with the suit itself is it lacks personality. Now, that is something that Toho has always understood by having usually one actor portray their monsters. You have a couple of stunt people in there, but for the most part, for the big scenes, it was portrayed by one man. And the most notable example is, of course, Haruo Nakajima, playing Godzilla. Now, this movie credits one person for playing Yongary. His name was Cho Kyung-min. In reality, there were tons of people who played Yongary. People would just kind of go in willy-nilly just because as soon as they got tired, they just put a new person in there. It's actually a very similar issue that I have to Gamera in the Showa era. It wasn't one man playing him. It was many, and so he kind of lacks a little bit of that personality, particularly early on. This is actually a really good segue, because Yongary Monster in the Deep shares a lot of similarities with Dae's Gamera. Yongary's horn, for example, shoots a laser, only a couple of times, and there is a reason for this. Like the Gamera films, right? Special effects directors for Yongary, preferred using practical fire effects rather than one like Godzilla, which was often animated. I gotta mention this. You can't ignore that there is a blatant hose in the mouth. But honestly, the reason why they did that was because it was cheaper and more efficient to do it, right there in camera than using animation and having to send it somewhere else to animate it. With Gamera, it was the same deal. It was because Dae had no department to handle such effects. Or with South Korea, they simply could not afford it to be elected or to as an option, to composite such shots. So the actual compositing of, live action elements with the special effects or animation in general, they kept to a very bare minimum in Yongary, simply because they just could not afford it, and they'd never really done it before. It also shares similarities with Gamera, as you can see, the glowing eyes. That's something I always thought made Gamera monsters kind of unique, was how their eyes glowed. But now I know why that is, and suddenly it makes perfect sense. The Yongary suit was designed by Ki-duk, but it was made by Masao Yagi. And it shows. He designed and built a lot of the suits for not only early Toho Kaiju films, but most of the Gamera movies. And I must agree with film historian Kim Song-ho in that this suit is a Gamera suit. The head looks very suspiciously like Barugan, just smaller, has the glowing eyes, has the glowing horn, has a flat mouth, and it certainly has, a little bit of personality, at least in terms of the designs. Honestly, the objective of Kim Ki-duk was to make this, a family-oriented film. Keeping that in mind, I actually think the design really reflects that, though the director wanted it to look more formidable. And he was a little let down with what Masao Yagi made, but they didn't have the money to, make a new suit. And quite frankly, I think the goofiness of the Yongary suit just kind of reflects the tone in which the director wanted anyway, so I think it kind of worked out. Which this brings me all to the dance scene. Now, this scene always garners a chuckle from the audience. It's just baffling that this is in this movie. Now, to us in the States, this scene is just stupid and silly and, fits well in with a lot of what Japan was doing at this time, except it was Korean. To the South Koreans, this scene actually means something else entirely. It's not just a stupid, silly, dumb scene. And that's because the song that is being played here is called Arirang, which is one of the most famous South Korean folklore songs, but instead they just covered it and did it with surf rock.
Go, Yongary, go!
That is a traditional folk Korean song that would instantly be recognizable from a South Korean audience or anybody familiar with South Korean culture. And Kim Ki-duk apparently wanted this to add levity to what he viewed as a darker South Korean movie. Now, this is interesting. That whole little bit of info that I just dumped upon you, I find rather interesting because this is a family-focused picture using traditional Korean folk music, but with a modern twist. See how that connects with everything that I've just talked about earlier? And all of this kind of accumulates in presenting South Korea in a rather positive light. A country ripped in two forcefully, having just gone through a horrible war. Most of South Korea's cities destroyed, thousands dead. It's utterly terrible. The images of Yongary destroying Seoul. We see people in traditional garb running, cities being destroyed, not dissimilar to scenes within the first Godzilla film, though admittedly they are much tamer within this film. People sitting in the audience watching Yongary would connect those dots. Same with the music. They would connect those dots with those images. And they would remember the war in a very similar to light to how audiences reacted to Godzilla when it was released in 1954. Again, just on a much tamer light. Yongary itself appears for the first time in the town of Pyeongmunjang. Now that is the border between North and South Korea. That is the demarcation zone. I'd like to note that the monster then sweeps south from the north, causes a lot of damage and destruction, and it is now up to the South Koreans to defeat this northern threat, while also making big deals about preserving their own heritage.
I've been thinking a lot about those missiles. They might do more damage than Yongary.
And I'm very much afraid of one thing. If those missiles go, they could destroy one of the truly great landmarks of old Korea.
Now that is all interesting because at the same time we see Yongary smashing a building that looks very similar to the Japanese Diet Building. Now supposedly that got cheers from Korean audiences because it had that distinct Japanese architecture. And all of this is veiled under a giant monster movie. And I admire the creativeness here with all of this context in mind. But there's more to this film than what I've mentioned thus far. We talked about all the behind-the-scenes stuff. We've talked about some of the thematic elements within Yongary from Monster from the Deep. Let's go back. 1967, South Korea, they had no space program, nor would they be asked to spy on a country in the Middle East having nuclear tests. It's all complete and total fantasy. It presents South Korea in a very positive light and is capable of handling such a major crisis, such as a North Korean invasion, or, maybe a giant monster coming down from the north. While in reality, I don't really believe that was possible come 1967 South Korea, knowing how their economy was, knowing the state of their military. America would need to be involved if Yongary actually showed up and started wreaking havoc in South Korea. And I didn't notice this until the audio commentary, but you also note that there's a lot of women wearing 1960s clothing, but others are wearing traditional clothing. It's kind of a cultural clash going on here. But most importantly, and this ties back into what Park Chung-hee was pushing for when it came to Korean cinema, the family is seen together trying to vanquish the monster inside the helicopter at the end of the film. Unlike in Western cinema, where it's usually just a single hero that does everything, right? No, this is the entire family. The family must stick together no matter the risks. That fits perfectly with what the South Korean government wanted for their movies. Now, I'm not sure if this is true, but I found 2 essays actually discussing this element as well. Apparently, in 1960 South Korea, a lot of cultural analysts, I guess, thought that South Korea was going through a bit of crisis in terms of their masculinity. But this is probably due to the shame of being an annexed nation for 50 years. When they were being invaded, when there was an actual war going on in Korea, they needed the UN to come bail them out, most notably the United States, when they were attacked by North Korea. They couldn't do it themselves. Ironically, Japan was actually going through the opposite at around this time. They were trying to reconcile the idea of hyper-masculinity, a very toxic hyper-masculinity, which was leading up into and including World War II. This level of hypermasculinity, which ultimately led to Japan's downfall. South Korea wanted the opposite. They wanted to reclaim that masculinity. Now, I'd point out here that there are 3 male leads to save the day. You have the astronaut who is carrying out an international mission, and then he flies a helicopter dispatched to kill Yongary. We have the scientist who finds the method in which to kill Yongary. And then we have the little boy who finds what Yongary's weakness actually is. Now mix that element in with the family being together as a unit and all being together in that one scene, and it all connects together. It all makes sense why this film is the way it is. They also make a point in this film of mentioning that there is a UN scientific committee which is being sent to South Korea.
Gentlemen, the United Nations has just announced that they will help us. An expert team of scientists has been ordered to come to Korea.
They never appear, and this is very unlike Japanese movies of the day. You had a lot of actors that were coming to Japan to star in their, science fiction films, such as Nick Adams, Russ Tamblyn, Richard Jekyll, Rhodes Reeson, to name a few. And that was to add an international appeal in an effort to handle the monster problem. They would often these movies were often interjecting, Western audiences. Shochiku at the same time. They had Peggy Neal in the X from Outer Space to give it a Western edge. Toei, you also had Terror Beneath the Sea. Gamera, it was even more interesting because they would often get Western children to play alongside one of the Japanese children to create some sort of dynamic duo. Now, Ki-duk and the writers opted to make it just Korean. So that UN scientific committee never shows up. It was just Koreans that saved the day. So the music deliberately chosen to be a famous Korean folk song, the fantasy of it all, it is a movie made to make Koreans proud of themselves, both from a filmmaking standpoint and for the movie itself. And at the time of its release, it was hailed by South Korean critics for its, quote, realism and, quote, despite being a Japanese-inspired movie, one feels the Korean spirit, one critic wrote. Now, with all of that being said, all the praise that I gave, the filmmakers' state of South Korean cinema, and with all that context in mind to sort of help me watch the movie and understand why the movie is the way it is, It's not a good movie. It's full of inconsistent characters left and right, most notably the little boy. One moment it's brooding and dark, and then the next we have a kid dancing with a giant monster in the background. Why is the kid sympathetic toward Yongary one minute, then causing him agony in the other, and laughing at Yongary being in utter pain? We see him laughing at Yongary literally bleeding out of his ass at the end of the movie, and suddenly he just wants to stop, like he takes a 180-degree turn all of a sudden.
Elo, you were right. How wonderful. Stop, please. No, don't do it anymore.
Oh, what is it?
It is nothing more, if you really break it down, just from its story, a by-the-books monster movie. It didn't have the character and personality that we saw from, like, the works of Shinichi Sekizawa over in Japan, which were so crazy and bonkers and full of light and personality. No, this is more of a by-the-numbers monster movie. With all that context and the behind-the-scenes stuff in mind, I can at least admire it. I can admire its ambition. And I can really sit back here now and comfortably say that, this really is more than just a Godzilla knockoff. This was South Korea doing something a little ballsy for them. And while the film, essentially it cost so much money, it didn't succeed over in South Korea, it at least succeeded in being shown overseas. It's very interesting. And I can't help but sit back now and, if I watch the movie for some weird reason, I admire it now. I admire the filmmakers. I admire the spirit of the movie, even if I don't necessarily like the movie itself. Well, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for either listening or watching this, depending on what, platform you're on. Do hit the subscribe button, hit the like button. Absolutely glad to have you here. We'll see you around. This is Adam Noyce of Vanian Productions saying sayonara.